What happens when the vow, "Till death do us part," becomes less of a promise and more of a to-do list? We've all seen stories of grief and loss. But what you're about to hear is a story of grief as a performance, and loss as a stepping stone to a dark and audacious freedom. It's a tale of a wife who planned a funeral for the husband she murdered, a funeral where the guest of honor wasn't in the casket. And the most unbelievable part? Her lover, her co-conspirator, decided to attend. This story is a journey into a mind so cold and calculating, it will leave you questioning everything you think you know about love and betrayal. To make sure you don't miss a single, chilling detail of this and our future stories, take a moment now to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You're going to want to be here for this. The silence in the Sterling estate was a physical entity. It had weight and texture, a smothering velvet cloak woven from threads of unspoken resentment and years of calculated indifference. To the outside world, the grand Georgian mansion, with its manicured lawns rolling down to the placid waters of Willow Creek Lake, was a monument to success. It was the physical manifestation of Arthur Sterling's empire, an empire built on ruthless acquisitions and an almost psychic understanding of market fluctuations. And Eleanor Sterling, his wife of 15 years, was meant to be its queen. She was as beautiful and as exquisitely maintained as the home she presided over, a flawless piece in Arthur's collection of perfect things. But like a priceless vase kept under glass, she was for display only. Arthur's affection was a transaction, his touch a confirmation of ownership. Their marriage had been a merger of old money and new power. Her family had the lineage. He had the brute force of a fortune he had carved out of the world with his own two hands. In the beginning, the arrangement had suited Eleanor. The security was a balm on the wounds of a past she was desperate to outrun, and the luxury was a distraction. But distractions, by their nature, are temporary. The years had peeled back the gilded veneer to reveal the hollow core of her existence. The silence of the mansion was now a deafening roar, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a countdown to an end she had not yet dared to imagine. Her life was a meticulously curated schedule of charity luncheons, gallery openings, and dinner parties where the conversation was as dry as the Chardonnay. She moved through these events with a serene grace that was often mistaken for contentment. No one saw the silent screams behind her placid smile. No one until Julian. Julian Thorne was a storm in the sterile, climate-controlled art gallery of her life. He was a poet who painted, or a painter who wrote poetry, was never quite sure which. She'd met him at a benefactor's gala. He was the artist in residence, a title he found amusingly pretentious. While everyone else was discussing acquisitions and portfolios, Julian was in a corner, sketching the beautiful vultures on a cocktail napkin. Eleanor had been captivated not by his art, but by the fire in his eyes, a fierce, untamed blaze of passion that she had thought was long extinguished in the world, and certainly within herself. Their affair was not a sordid secret whispered in hushed tones. It was a desperate, gasping breath of life. His small, chaotic studio, smelling of turpentine, linseed oil, and cheap red wine, became her sanctuary. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the Sterling estate. With Julian, she was not Mrs. Arthur Sterling, the society hostess. She was Eleanor, a woman with dreams she'd forgotten she had, and a body that yearned for a touch that wasn't a negotiation. Julian saw the vibrant colors of her soul, trapped beneath the grayscale portrait of her life. He didn't want to own her, he wanted to set her free. And it was in the sanctuary of his paint-splattered loft, tangled in his sheets, that the first whispers of a terrible, liberating idea began to take root. Divorce was an impossibility. Arthur Sterling did not lose. He did not lose in business, and he would certainly not tolerate the public humiliation of a wife leaving him. He would crush her. He would use his army of lawyers to paint her as an unstable, adulterous gold digger, and he would win. He would leave her with nothing but the tattered remnants of her reputation. No, a legal separation was a battle she could not win. But there were other kinds of separation, a more permanent kind. The idea, at first, was a fleeting, intrusive thought, a dark sliver of madness. What if he just wasn't here anymore? But the thought returned, again and again, each time a little stronger, a little more seductive. She began to nurture it, to water it with her resentment and fertilize it with her dreams of a future with Julian. She started to see it not as a murder, but as a correction, a necessary amputation to save the rest of her life. Convincing Julian was the most delicate part of the plan. He was a romantic, a man who saw the world in shades of beauty and tragedy, not in the cold, hard lines of strategy. To him, murder was the stuff of Gothic novels, not a practical solution to a domestic problem. So Eleanor, with the same meticulous care she used to plan her dinner parties, began her campaign. She didn't speak of murder. She spoke of fear. She subtly embellished Arthur's coldness into cruelty, his indifference into a silent, psychological warfare. She would call Julian in tears, speaking of veiled threats, of the way Arthur's eyes seemed to look right through her, as if she were already dead. She painted a picture of a man who was not just an unloving husband, but a monster in a bespoke suit. Blinded by love and a chivalrous desire to protect her, Julian slowly, reluctantly, came to see things her way. He never said the word murder, but he stopped flinching when she did. He became her silent, willing accomplice, his love for her a tool she sharpened and aimed at the heart of her husband. The method had to be as perfect and as untraceable as her public persona. A gun was too loud, too messy. A knife too intimate. It had to be quiet, elegant, and, most importantly, attributable to natural causes. Arthur was a man of rigid routine. He was also a man who prided himself on his health, save for one vice. A single, expensive glass of scotch every night at precisely 10 o'clock, taken in the solitude of his leather-bound library. This ritual, a symbol of his control and discipline, would be his undoing. Eleanor spent weeks in the digital underworld, her evenings, once spent planning seating charts, now dedicated to researching obscure cardiac toxins. She found what she was looking for on a dark web forum, a place where chemistry and criminality intersected. It was a synthetic compound derived from a rare Amazonian frog, a potent cardiotoxin that mimicked the effects of a sudden, catastrophic heart attack. It was odorless, tasteless, and, according to the anonymous seller, utterly undetectable by standard toxicological screens. The payment was made in an untraceable cryptocurrency, the package arriving a week later, nestled in a discreetly wrapped box of Belgian chocolates. The night she chose was a Tuesday in April. The air was thick with the scent of blooming wisteria, a sweet, cloying perfume that would forever be linked in her memory with the metallic taste of fear. She had played the role of the devoted wife to perfection all evening. She'd complimented Arthur on a recent business victory, feigned interest in his monologue on market trends, and wore the diamond earrings he had given her for their last anniversary, a cold, beautiful bribe for another year of her life. At 9:55 p.m., she excused herself, claiming a headache. From the shadowed alcove at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase, she watched. She was a spectator at the final act of her own life's play. She saw Arthur enter the library, his movements as precise and predictable as always. The clink of the crystal decanter, the soft glug of the 30-year-old single malt, the single perfect ice cube dropped into the glass. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was the moment. There was no turning back. Earlier that day, while the cleaning staff was occupied elsewhere, she had used a tiny syringe to inject a few drops of the clear, viscous liquid into the neck of the decanter, just below the stopper. It was a minuscule amount, but lethally potent. Arthur settled into his favorite wingback chair, the one with the worn leather that smelled of old books and his expensive cologne. He took a sip, then another. He swirled the amber liquid, his eyes closing in a moment of quiet satisfaction. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Eleanor's breath hitched. Had it failed? Had she been scammed by some anonymous internet ghoul? Then Arthur's eyes snapped open. A look of profound confusion crossed his face. He made a small, guttural sound, more of a grunt than a gasp. His hand went to his chest, his fingers clawing at the fine wool of his suit jacket. The crystal tumbler slipped from his grasp, shattering on the Persian rug, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. His body stiffened, a violent, arching spasm. His legs kicked out, knocking over a small side table. His face, which was usually a mask of controlled composure, was now a grotesque canvas of shock and agony. His wide, terrified eyes swept the room and, for a horrifying instant, they seemed to lock onto her shadowy form on the staircase. In that final, fleeting moment of his life, did he know? Did he see the truth in the face of his angel of death? Then, with a final, shuddering exhalation, he went still. The silence that descended upon the library was different from the one that had preceded it. This was a true, absolute silence. The silence of an ending. Eleanor remained frozen, her hand gripping the mahogany banister so tightly her knuckles were white. The smell of spilled scotch and wisteria filled the air. It was done. A wave of something, not guilt, not remorse, but a dizzying, terrifying adrenaline surged through her. With a composure that felt alien to her, she glided down the stairs, her silk robe whispering against the polished wood. She knelt beside him, her fingers pressing against the carotid artery she knew was still. His eyes were open, staring at the coffered ceiling with a look of stunned surprise. She felt a strange, cold detachment. She was not looking at her husband. She was looking at a problem that had been solved. She took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing her lines. She picked up the phone, her hand perfectly steady. She dialed 911. When the operator answered, Eleanor unleashed a scream, a raw, piercing shriek of such convincing anguish and terror, it would have earned her an Academy Award. "My husband," she sobbed, her voice cracking perfectly. Oh God, I think he's had a heart attack." The rest of the night was a masterfully orchestrated performance. She was the picture of the devastated widow, her grief so palpable that the paramedics and police officers spoke to her in hushed, reverent tones. The preliminary conclusion was exactly what she had planned. A massive coronary event, likely brought on by stress. Arthur Sterling, the man who had conquered the world, had been defeated by his own heart. No one suspected a thing. The news of his death sent ripples through their elite community. The phone began its relentless ringing, the doorbell a constant chime announcing the arrival of another sympathy casserole or bouquet of funereal lilies. Eleanor received them all with a quiet, shattered dignity. But as she moved through the motions of the grieving widow, a new, even more audacious idea began to form in her mind. It was born of a deep-seated contempt for the world Arthur had inhabited, a world of surfaces and performances. If her marriage had been a performance, then his death should be her grand finale. Arthur's body was at the morgue, awaiting the formality of an autopsy that she was certain would reveal nothing. But the world expected a funeral, a grand, ostentatious affair befitting a man of his stature. And Eleanor would give them one. But it would be a funeral unlike any other. It would be a piece of macabre theater, a final, secret joke played on a world she despised. She met with the most sought-after funeral director in the state, a man whose somber professionalism was his greatest asset. She chose the most expensive casket, a work of art in polished cherry wood and brass fittings. She selected the music, the readings, and the mountains of white flowers. But she also made a special request. She told the funeral director, her voice choked with fabricated tears, that Arthur had a morbid, lifelong fear of being buried. He had made her promise, she lied, that he would be cremated immediately after death, with no one present but her. The funeral, the empty casket, it was all for show. It was to give his friends and colleagues a chance to say their goodbyes, to have the closure that a public ceremony provided. The funeral director, a man accustomed to the eccentricities of the grieving rich, nodded with solemn understanding. The request was unusual but not unheard of. The arrangements were made. Arthur Sterling's body would be quietly turned to ash, while the world prepared to mourn an empty box. That night, after the last of the sympathizers had left, Eleanor stood alone in the cavernous silence of her home. She walked into the library, the shattered glass and the dark stain on the rug already removed by a discreet cleaning service. She poured herself a glass of scotch from the same decanter, her hand steady, her resolve absolute. She was free. She had not just escaped her cage. She had burned it to the ground. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. The first act was over. The stage was now being set for the second. A funeral that would be the greatest performance of her life. A final, audacious deception. And there was one more detail to arrange. A final flourish that would make her victory complete. She picked up her phone and dialed Julian's number. She needed her leading man to be in the audience for her finest hour. The 5 days between Arthur's death and his funeral were, for Eleanor, a period of intense and exhilarating artistic creation. Her art form was deception, her medium was grief, and her masterpiece was rapidly taking shape. The Sterling mansion became her studio, a grand, silent space where she could sculpt and refine her performance. Each sympathy call she answered, each condolence letter she read, was a rehearsal. She learned to modulate her voice to the perfect pitch of quiet devastation, to let her eyes well with tears at precisely the right moment, to clutch a black-bordered handkerchief with a believable tremor in her hand. Her most challenging scene was with her mother-in-law, a formidable matriarch with eyes as sharp and cold as shattered ice. Beatrice Sterling arrived like a conquering general, her grief a weapon she wielded with terrifying precision. She swept into the house, her face a mask of tragic nobility, and immediately began to critique the flower arrangements. Eleanor knew that Beatrice's suspicion would be her greatest hurdle. The old woman had never believed Eleanor was worthy of her son, and she would be searching for any crack in the facade of the grieving widow. "He worked himself to death," Beatrice announced, her voice echoing in the grand foyer. It was not a statement of sadness, but an accusation. "I told him he needed a wife who would be a comfort, not another acquisition." Eleanor met the woman's icy gaze, her own eyes a well of carefully crafted sorrow. "I loved him, Beatrice," she whispered, her voice catching. "He was my whole world. I don't know how I'll go on without him." She let a single, perfect tear escape and trace a path down her cheek. It was a masterful touch. She saw a flicker of something in Beatrice's eyes, not sympathy, perhaps, but a grudging acceptance of the performance. For now she had passed the audition. While the world saw a woman drowning in sorrow, Eleanor was, in reality, a ruthlessly efficient administrator. She managed the clandestine arrangements for Arthur's cremation with the same precision she had once used to manage their social calendar. She spoke with the crematorium director on a private, encrypted line, giving him a false name and a fabricated backstory. The body of Mr. Smith would be processed with no ceremony and no witnesses. The ashes were to be held until further notice. She paid in cash, a thick envelope of $100 bills delivered by a trusted courier who knew better than to ask questions. With Arthur's physical form reduced to a box of anonymous gray dust, the central prop for her theatrical production was now safely offstage. Her focus then shifted to the funeral itself. It was to be a spectacle of grief, an opera of mourning. The grand stone cathedral downtown was booked. Thousands of white calla lilies and gardenias flowers that symbolized magnificence and purity, an irony that pleased her immensely, were ordered. A renowned cellist was hired to play Bach's suites for solo cello, their melancholic beauty designed to bring even the most stoic captain of industry to tears. She wrote the eulogy herself, a work of such tender, heartbreaking fiction that it made her own eyes water to read it. It was a love letter to a man who had never existed, a tribute to a marriage that had been a hollow sham. But the centerpiece of her creation, the object on which all eyes would be fixed, was the casket. It was a magnificent sarcophagus of polished mahogany, lined with cream-colored silk, its brass handles gleaming under the showroom lights. Cost more than most people's cars. And it was, of course, gloriously, beautifully empty. She stood with the funeral director, Mr. Abernathy, as she made her selection, her hand resting lightly on the cool, smooth wood. "It's what he would have wanted," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Something substantial, even if it's just for show." "My dear Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice a professional balm of sympathy, "grief manifests in many ways. The important thing is that this ceremony brings you comfort. It is a symbol, a focal point for remembrance. Oh, it's a symbol. All right, Eleanor thought, a cold smile touching the corners of her mind. It's a symbol of my freedom. Her nights were a strange cocktail of anxiety and euphoria. The sheer audacity of her plan was a potent stimulant, keeping her awake long after the sleeping pill she'd pretended to take had worn off. She would wander the silent, moonlit rooms of the mansion, a glass of Arthur's finest brandy in her hand. She was the ghost of a life that was already over, haunting the set of a play whose final act had been a murder. The silence no longer oppressed her. It comforted her. It was the silence of a clean slate. It was during one of these late-night wanderings that she made the most reckless and, to her, the most brilliant decision of all. She picked up her burner phone and called Julian. He answered on the first ring, his voice a frantic whisper. "Eleanor? Are you okay? I've been going out of my mind." "I'm more than okay, my love," she said, her voice a low, seductive purr. "I'm free. We're free." "I saw his picture in the paper," Julian said, the horror still fresh in his voice. "It doesn't feel real." "But it is," she assured him. "And now there is just one last thing to do. One final performance. And I want you to be there." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" "The funeral, Julian," she said, the words thrilling on her tongue. "I want you to come." "No, absolutely not," he said, his voice rising in panic. "Eleanor, that's insane. Someone might recognize me. Someone might have seen us. No one will." She cut him off, her voice firm, confident. "You will be just another man in a dark suit. A distant business associate from out of town. No one will look at you twice. But I will. I will be looking at you." She could sense his fear, his resistance. She knew he was not built for this kind of cold-blooded deception. He was an artist, a man of raw, unfiltered emotion. But she also knew how to play him, how to pluck the strings of his love and devotion. "I need you there, Julian," she whispered, her voice softening into a plea. "When I am standing up there, saying goodbye to him, I need to look out and see our future. I need to see you. It will be our secret, our final victory shared between just the two of us. Imagine it, my love. All those people mourning a man they never really knew, and you and I, the only two people in the world who know the truth. It's a masterpiece of irony. It's art." The word art was the key. She had framed it in a way he could understand, as a piece of performance art, a final, defiant creation. She heard him take a shaky breath. "Okay," he finally whispered, his voice a mixture of terror and excitement. "For you. I'll be there." A triumphant smile spread across Eleanor's face. The final, most dangerous piece of her composition was now in place. The day of the funeral arrived under a sky the color of slate. The air was cool and damp, a suitably somber pathetic fallacy for the occasion. Eleanor dressed with the ritualistic care of a high priestess preparing for a sacred ceremony. The black dress was custom-made, a sheath of French silk that was both severe and devastatingly elegant. Her only jewelry was a single strand of gray pearls. Her face, beneath a delicate black veil, was a pale, tragic mask. The cathedral was a cavernous space, its cold stone walls absorbing the hushed whispers of the hundreds of mourners who had gathered to pay their respects. The air was thick with the funereal scent of lilies and beeswax. As Eleanor walked down the central aisle on the arm of Arthur's stoic younger brother, a wave of camera flashes erupted from the press who had gathered outside, their strobes illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stained glass light. She was the star of this tragic opera, and she moved towards the front pew with a slow, heartbreaking grace. The empty, polished casket sat on a bier before the altar, surrounded by a mountain of white flowers. It was the dark, silent sun around which this entire universe of grief revolved. Eleanor took her seat, bowed her head, and allowed her shoulders to shake with a silent, controlled sob. Then, she lifted her head and let her eyes, shielded by the veil, scan the pews. Her heart gave a jolt. There he was, Julian. He was sitting in the back, halfway down the side aisle, exactly as she had instructed. He looked pale and nervous in his ill-fitting rented suit, but he was there. He was a splash of raw, dangerous color in a sea of monotonous black. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a spark of shared conspiracy arcing across the hallowed space. It was a moment of pure, terrifying exhilaration. She had done it. All the pieces were in place. The service began. The organ music swelled, its mournful chords echoing in the vaulted ceiling. The priest, a man with a kind, sorrowful face, spoke of Arthur's generosity, his vision, his contributions to the city. Business partners and old friends delivered eulogies filled with respectful platitudes and carefully chosen anecdotes. Eleanor listened to it all with a serene, sorrowful expression, while inside, she was vibrating with a triumphant, electric energy. When it was her turn to speak, a profound hush fell over the congregation. She moved to the lectern, her steps slow and measured. She looked out over the sea of faces, finding Julian's once more. He gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only encouragement she needed. She delivered her eulogy, her voice a fragile, trembling instrument that nonetheless carried to every corner of the vast cathedral. She spoke of a gentle, loving husband, of shared dreams and quiet moments of tenderness. The fiction was so beautiful, so perfectly rendered, that for a moment, even she wanted to believe it. She ended by reading a short poem one Julian had written for her, about a love that transcends even death. The irony was so thick, so potent, she could almost taste it. As she finished, she pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, her body racked with a final, convincing sob. The sound of weeping echoed throughout the cathedral. The performance was a resounding success. She returned to her seat, her body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. The service drew to a close. The priest gave a final blessing, and the 6 pallbearers, all of them senior executives from Arthur's company, lined up to perform their final duty. They were all large, powerful men, but their faces were grim with the effort of lifting what they believed to be a heavy, body-filled casket. Eleanor watched, a strange, giddy lightness filling her. It was the most absurd, most wonderful piece of theater she had ever witnessed. 6 strong men, struggling with the weight of nothing, the weight of a lie. As they began their slow, solemn procession down the aisle, it happened. The man at the front right corner, a portly executive named Henderson, was visibly sweating. As he adjusted his grip, his foot slipped on the polished marble floor. He stumbled, and for a heart-stopping second, the casket tilted at a precarious angle. A collective gasp swept through the cathedral. Beatrice Sterling let out a small, horrified cry. Before anyone could react, a figure darted out from one of the side pews. It was Julian. Acting on pure, unthinking impulse, he lunged forward, his hands reaching out to grab the edge of the casket, steadying it with surprising strength. He and the flustered Henderson exchanged a quick, grateful look. The procession paused for a moment, the crisis averted. Then, with a series of relieved sighs from the onlookers, they continued on their way. Julian, his face flushed with adrenaline, quickly and discreetly slipped back towards the side exit and disappeared. The entire incident had lasted no more than 10 seconds. To everyone else in the cathedral, it was a moment of minor drama, a near disaster saved by the quick thinking of a stranger. They saw a hero, but Eleanor saw something else. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over her, extinguishing the triumphant fire that had been burning within her. She saw her lover, her co-conspirator, a man whose hands were metaphorically stained with her husband's murder, placing those same hands on the empty casket that was the symbol of their crime. He had broken the one rule she had given him, to be invisible. In his desperate, foolish need to be a hero, he had stepped into the spotlight. And in that spotlight, Eleanor saw the first, terrifying crack in her perfect, beautiful lie. The play was not over, and she had just lost control of her leading man. The reception at the Sterling estate was a masterclass in performative mourning. The oppressive scent of lilies followed the guests from the cathedral, now mingling with the incongruous aromas of catered champagne and shrimp cocktails. Voices that had been hushed in reverence were now restored to their usual timbre of discreet gossip and business chatter. It was a wake disguised as a networking event. Eleanor, at the center of it all, was a study in tragic perfection. She floated through the crowded rooms, a ghost in her own home, her face a carefully composed mask of sorrow that concealed a growing, frantic panic. Her eyes constantly scanned the crowd, searching. Julian was supposed to have vanished after the service. That was the plan. Disappear. Become a ghost. But his impulsive act at the cathedral had changed the script. He hadn't just stepped into the spotlight. He seemed to be basking in it. She finally located him near the grand piano, surrounded by a small group of Arthur's business associates. And standing right beside him, with a fatherly hand on his shoulder, was Mr. Henderson, the pallbearer who had stumbled. Quickest thinking I've ever seen. Henderson was booming, his face still ruddy from the earlier excitement. If it weren't for this young man, we would have had a terrible tragedy on top of an already tragic day. Arthur would have been, well, he would have been mortified. A cold sweat trickled down Eleanor's spine. Julian, to her horror, was not deflecting the praise. He was accepting it with a shy, pleased smile. He was no longer an anonymous face in the crowd. He was the hero of the funeral. He had a name, a face, and now, a story that connected him directly to the day's events. "My name is Julian Thorne," she heard him say to the group. "I'm an artist. I admired Mr. Sterling's collection from afar. I felt I had to come and pay my respects. An artist." The word hung in the air, a bright, dangerous flag. It made him memorable. It made him interesting. It made him a liability of catastrophic proportions. Eleanor knew she had to intervene, to pull him away from this dangerous new role he was auditioning for. As she started to move toward him, a hand gently touched her elbow. "Mrs. Sterling." She turned to see a man in an unremarkable, slightly rumpled suit. His eyes were tired but missed nothing. "Detective Miller, my condolences on your loss. Do you have a moment?" The name sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. He was the lead investigator, the man she had spoken to on the night of Arthur's death. "Of course, Detective," she said, her voice smooth as silk, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Just a follow-up. The final coroner's report came in this morning," he said, his voice low, forcing her to lean in closer. "It's interesting." "Interesting," Eleanor repeated, forcing a look of weary confusion onto her face. "The official cause of death is still cardiac arrest," Miller continued, his eyes locked on hers, searching for the slightest flicker. "But the toxicology screen flagged something. An anomaly. They had to run it through a more advanced mass spectrometer. They found trace elements of a highly complex synthetic alkaloid, a poison designed to mimic a heart attack." The world tilted on its axis. The air in the crowded room seemed to suddenly become thin, unbreathable, untraceable. The word mocked her from the dark corners of her memory. She had built her entire new world on that one single word, and it had been a lie. "Poison," she gasped, her performance now fueled by a surge of genuine, terrifying shock. "Detective, that's impossible. Who would want to poison Arthur?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Miller said, his gaze unwavering. "We've started looking into his business dealings, of course. A man like your husband makes enemies. But we also have to look closer to home. These types of poisons, they're intimate. They require access." He let the word hang in the air between them. "We'll need to speak with you again, more formally, down at the station." He nodded curtly and melted back into the crowd, leaving Eleanor frozen in place. The foundation of her reality had just been pulverized. This was no longer a perfect, elegant crime. It was a murder investigation, and she was the primary suspect. Her eyes snapped back to Julian. He was now laughing at a joke one of the executives had told, a champagne flute held aloft in his hand. The sight filled her with a rage so pure and so cold it burned away every last vestige of her panic. her love for him, their shared dream of a future together, it all evaporated in that instant. He was no longer her partner, her savior, her passionate artist. He was a piece of evidence, a loose thread that, when pulled by a man like Detective Miller, would unravel everything. He was a talking, breathing, impulsive, romantic fool who would lead the police directly to her door. The calculation in her mind was instantaneous and ruthless. The problem was no longer Arthur. The problem was Julian. And just as she had dealt with the first problem, she would now have to deal with the second. With a newfound, chilling clarity of purpose, she made her way through the throng of mourners. She intercepted Julian as he was getting a fresh glass of champagne. She pulled him into a secluded alcove, hidden behind a large floral arrangement. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. Her eyes, no longer soft with grief, were hard and sharp as flint. Julian looked taken aback, his happy buzz instantly punctured by her fury. "What are you talking about? They were thanking me. I was just being polite." "You were supposed to be invisible," she seethed. "Now half of Arthur's company knows your name and that you're an artist. How long before the police start asking questions? How long before they find a photo of us somewhere? You were reckless. You were stupid." His face fell, the adoration in his eyes replaced by a wounded confusion. "I was just trying to help. I love you." The words, which had once thrilled her, now grated on her nerves. Love was a weakness she could no longer afford, but she could still use it. Her expression softened in an instant, the rage masked by a look of desperate fear. "I know, my love, I know," she said, her hand coming up to caress his cheek. "I'm sorry. I'm just on edge. It's been a terrible day." She leaned in, her lips close to his ear. "But you're right. We deserve to celebrate. Tonight, meet me at the studio. Midnight, after everyone is gone. We can finally begin our life together. The life we've dreamed of." The hope returned to his eyes, as she knew it would. He was so predictable, so easy to manipulate. "Really?" he breathed. "Yes," she whispered, sealing the promise with a soft, quick kiss, a Judas kiss. "I'll bring the champagne." He nodded eagerly, his heart once again hers to command. He squeezed her hand and, with a final, adoring look, he slipped out a side door and was gone. Eleanor returned to her guests, her composure absolute. She was the grieving widow once more, but beneath the placid surface, her mind was working with the cold, brutal efficiency of a shark. She stayed until the last guest had departed, thanking them for their support, her voice a perfect symphony of sorrow. Then, when the house was finally silent, she went to work. She went to Arthur's study, a room she hadn't entered since his death. She opened his humidor and took out a small, exquisite mother-of-pearl box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a syringe and several small vials of clear liquid. It was Arthur's emergency heart medication, a powerful beta-blocker he kept on hand for his angina. In a healthy person, an injection of this dosage would be catastrophic. It would stop the heart almost instantly, a death that would look, for all the world, like another sudden, tragic cardiac arrest. The irony was exquisite. Julian would die of a broken heart, delivered by Arthur's own medicine. She drove through the city, the vial and syringe cold in her designer handbag. The studio, which had once been her vibrant, colorful sanctuary, now looked drab and pathetic. She let herself in with her key. The large canvas he had been working on was on the easel. It was a portrait of her, but not as the grieving widow. In the painting, she was standing in a storm, her hair flying, a look of fierce, triumphant power in her eyes. It was how he saw her, the queen who had won. He had captured her true self, a self she could never allow the world to see. When he arrived at midnight, his face was alight with a love so pure it was almost pitiable. He rushed to her, wrapping her in his arms. "We did it, Eleanor. We're finally free." "Yes, my love," she murmured into his shoulder, her hand reaching into her purse. "We are." She had the syringe in her hand, the cap already removed. She told him she had a surprise for him, a new kind of kiss, and asked him to close his eyes. He obeyed without question, a blissful smile on his face. He trusted her completely. It was his final, fatal mistake. With a single, swift, practiced motion, she plunged the needle into the side of his neck, into the carotid artery, and depressed the plunger. His eyes snapped open, wide with shock and a dawning, horrifying understanding. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his neck. He looked at her, his lips forming her name, but no sound came out. His expression was not one of anger, but of a deep, soul-shattering betrayal. He collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing for a moment, and then he was still. His eyes, the eyes that had seen her as a queen, were now vacant, staring at nothing. Eleanor stood over him, her breathing even, her hand steady. She felt a profound and chilling emptiness. She was not a monster. Monsters felt rage or glee. She felt nothing. It was simply the last necessary step. The final loose end. She worked with a clean, detached efficiency. She used a cloth to wipe her fingerprints from the door handle. She took his hand and wrapped his own fingers around the syringe, pressing it into his palm. It would look like he had administered it himself. Then she sat at his small, cluttered desk. She took out a piece of his drawing paper and a pen. In a shaky, frantic script, she began to write, carefully forging his handwriting from the love poems he had written her. It was a suicide note, a confession. It spoke of his overwhelming guilt over his affair with her, and how, in a fit of jealous madness, he had poisoned Arthur Sterling so they could be together. It ended with the words, "I can't live with what I've done." She never knew. It was all me. She placed the note on the table next to him. It was perfect. She had given the police their killer. Julian Thorne, the tortured artist, driven to murder and then suicide by a tragic, obsessive love. She, Eleanor Sterling, would be the victim in this narrative. The poor, grieving widow, betrayed by a secret lover she never knew was a monster. Before she left, she paused in front of the portrait. She looked at the powerful, triumphant woman on the canvas. With a sudden, cold fury, she picked up a palette knife, dipped it in black paint, and slashed a vicious, diagonal line across the face of the queen. She would not be captured, not even in art. Eleanor Sterling walked out of the studio and into the pre-dawn chill. She did not look back. The city was quiet. She was utterly, completely alone. All the pieces had been removed from the board, leaving only the queen, standing victorious on a field of bodies. She was free, and her reign, in the silent, empty kingdom she had built, was just beginning.